my studio. The date is Sunday, July 7th, 2024. Thanks for being here. As always, it's just me. I'm going over Supreme Court cases that are recent. This is very recent history. In fact, dare I say, this is current events. We are looking at the most important Supreme Court cases of the 2023-2024 term. So we had a total, if you look at the description, we had a total of 62 decisions in this term. And I would say a lot of them were actually fairly important. Impactful, maybe is the better word. We don't know for sure how many of these cases are actually going to have long-term consequential effects. So that's why often when I make a video for my Supreme Court brief series, I like to wait at least a few years to see, okay, how important is this case really? Because I remember when what year was it? 2010, was it now? The Citizens United case went down and everybody said the sky was falling in and it was like the worst decision ever. The worst decision going back to Plessy v. Ferguson or whatever. It was bad, but I don't think it was as bad as people made it out to be at the time. And I am seeing a lot of sensationalism right now. I'm seeing a lot of people freaking out. And so part of the reason why I'm doing this stream is to put some ease, into the minds of some of my viewers at least, because I know many of you are freaking out. And in fact, as my thumbnail says, the Supreme Court is going to be flexing this term. I mean, this is the most consequential court I've seen, maybe in my lifetime. John Roberts, the Roberts Court has been surprising. I didn't think they would be doing so much. I thought they'd be more hands-off and more taking on more boring cases, but a lot of these cases I do think are consequential. And so I'll be going through 10 of them 10 of the 62 decisions that I think are probably the most important of all of the decisions that came out, most of them announced over the last few weeks. Many of them you probably already know about, like the big two, which were announced within the last 10 days. That would be the Trump immunity case, as well as the overturning of the Chevron doctrine. And then if there are any other cases that you would like for me to bring up, I will, but I'm basically just giving you a nuts and bolts explainer version of what went down, the big question in each case, and how the court decided. I found a phenomenal website. Actually, the New York Times has been doing this the last few years. They have an interactive website that breaks down the cases really well. It also links to one of my favorite websites, which you'll see links in the description, SCOTUS blog. SCOTUS blog does a phenomenal job of making this stuff easier to digest because legalese can be confusing. And one of my goals of this channel is to break down complex Supreme Court cases into digestible forms in which anybody can understand this stuff. That's really my main goal with this entire channel, to simplify this stuff. I always end up oversimplifying, but that's okay, because I'd rather you start to at least get a grasp of this than just be so freaking overwhelmed and just ignore it because you're so overwhelmed because you don't understand any of it. So I'm hoping that at least some of this you'll understand. And then, I'll be checking. Thanks, Ricky, Tiki, Bobby, Wobbin. I am now of the opinion, on the record, I think that the Congress should expand the courts. I think FDR was right. This is, now, how you do it is another question. I think it should be over a long period of time so that it's less political, but I think I am definitely on board with this, and thanks for the super chat. But before I can start digging into these cases, I will say I usually am one of the first people to defend the Supreme Court. I know that this is the branch that the judicial branch as a whole is the branch of the federal government, especially, that tends to be the most educated and has the most pragmatic views in terms of the law. They are obviously all of them are biased. Every human being is biased. I keep saying this over and over, myself included, but they tend to at least try to avoid being biased, and they generally try to avoid being ideological. This time around, it was much more ideological. 2024, I haven't seen a Supreme Court this ideological, maybe ever, and that's not just hyperbole. I'm not exaggerating here. I just think that there are some in particular who have become very ideological, or at the very least partisan. Maybe partisan is the better term. They make it more about wins and losses for people that have the same political views as them. And the two most guilty of this, I think, are Justice Clarence Thomas and Justice Samuel Alito. I think that, they've been very disappointing. These two have been very disappointing. I think they're two of the worst Supreme Court justices in American history. This is my opinion. Now, you already saw my worst 10 list out, but both of them have received gifts, donations, bribes, you could call them. I would call them bribes. Yeah, I would call them bribes. And we've seen them as they've gotten older become more and more partisan, more and more about well, will this help my team? Will this help people that share my political views? Then yes, I'll go with it. Now, on the flip side, I want to defend another justice who has actually been surprisingly pretty decent. Do you know who I'm going to say? Can you take a guess? It's not Neil Gorsuch. Neil Gorsuch he surprises me sometimes. He's actually way better than Thomas and Alito. But no, any guess? Oh, Kavanaugh is another wonderful guess, but no, it is her, Amy Coney Barrett, ACB. This year in particular, I've read some of her opinions, and it's been refreshing to see that she actually has more nuanced views and, more importantly, pragmatic views on certain issues. Now, she still clearly leans to the right politically. That's okay. But she seems to be more in the real world and less partisan than some of the other right-leaning justices. And if you don't know this already, yeah, there are clearly right now, of the 9 justices, 6 of them lean to the right. It's pretty evident at this point, and 3 of them lean to the left. So it's a very, quote, conservative group that we have right now, and that's why a lot of people are very upset, and why a lot of people are voting for president this November strictly on this issue, strictly to vote for a president who will give them Supreme Court justices that lean to the left. Now remember, the Senate has to approve of all nominations of justices by the president, so they would have to win the Senate too. But regardless, this has become such a political, this has become such an electoral issue, I should say, because of just all of the partisanship, the inherent partisanship we have seen from this current Supreme Court. And they have really been, really been busy. Like I said at the beginning of this, 62 decisions this term, but it's not really the number, it's the quality of these cases. The New York Times has a wonderful website. Like I said, this is the interactive website, webpage. I've linked it in the description, where they break them all down. You see by category. These are the major categories that were covered in this term. So we're going to discuss the immunity case first, and then also, right after that, the other big one, the reversal of Chevron, the Chevron doctrine. And then I'm going to go through 8 others that I think are important, and then I'm going to start looking at your suggestions. for the rest. So before we do that, let's also more super chats. I'll try to get these kind of sprinkle these in. Thank you very much. Is any of this going to be on the next test? No, there is no test. And by the way, thanks for coming to summer school. I'm delighted you're here when you don't have to be. I'm not taking attendance. Thank you, Julian. Christian, thank you. We'd like to see another collab with logging through history on the arguments for and against the Electoral College as you have opposing views, such like now's a better time than ever. Okay, duly noted. I will reach out to him and we will make it happen. He does a lot of traveling in the summer, so we probably would do it more likely September, October, I'm thinking. But yes, I love the suggestion and thank you for the super chat. How about reduce the Supreme Court to one justice? Tommy, appreciate the super chat, but I disagree with that sentiment. I think you need a team of people. In fact, I would argue that one person as president these days, I think that's overrated as well. I think there needs to be probably a council instead of one person, one president. And I know that's weird to hear from the president's guy on YouTube, the guy who makes more videos about American presidents than probably, arguably, any other creator on this platform. But yeah, I think the presidency, it has too much, the president has too much power. We need to break it down, break it up. I know, it's weird. How often, oh wait, SI vlog, good to see you here. Yeah, long time viewer of the channel, I've always appreciated your support. How often do SCOTUS justices recuse themselves from a case? I would say it's not very often these days. Historically, it's more common back in the day. I would say per term, you see it happen at least once or twice. Often you see it these days when it's just strictly because there's a newbie in there, there's a new justice, like, for example, Brown, Jackson, she got in there and she didn't hear the oral arguments from some cases when she first got in a couple years ago, and so she did not decide because she was not there for oral arguments. So, but it does happen. It's not very often anymore. Brandon, thank you. Hey, Mr. Beast. Stop it. How do we keep the courts unbiased? You don't. You absolutely don't. Or how do we incorporate the court's biases into our checks and balance system? So this is why this is an argument for expanding the court, in my opinion. This is also an argument for making the court itself less powerful, although to do that I think we need to strengthen local courts and state courts and even the federal district courts, appellate courts. I think those all need to be strengthened as well in order to weaken this. But the Supreme Court has become incredibly powerful. It's more powerful now in 2024 than it ever has been in the 248 year long history of the country. So that's what I suggest. What is your opinion on how this will affect Trump? All of these cases have been a net positive for Trump. They have helped him. It doesn't mean that his charges are going away. I still think he's going to get in trouble. I still think he's going to face some consequences here. But all of these cases have been a net positive for him and the Republican Party. And thank you, Green. Joel Knoll, Switzerland has a council of 7 members of the largest 4 parties top executive, and I'm very happy with it. Yes, I'm somewhat familiar with how they do it in Switzerland, and I've heard and read good things as well, so I'm glad you like it. Thanks for bringing that to our attention. Harrison, good to see you. New PFP, I'm digging it. Simple Historian was angry on Twitter about Trump's immunity ruling. I saw that. He was irate. He was very loudly against it. I know you and him have similar views, so I'm curious to hear your opinion. I will get into that shortly, Harrison. Thanks for the super chat. Finally, we've got, I don't know how to pronounce that, but during these uncertain times and being the young person during this mess, I really do appreciate having your guiding ease our minds through it. Well, it's an honor, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much for the kind words, and I'm glad that you have that confidence in me. That means a lot. I will say that as a 42-year-old man, an elder millennial, these are dark times we are living through now, no doubt. It's naive. It's a bit. I think people that deny that are a little bit In denial. They're just in denial in general. You can't deny these are dark times overall because of what's been happening with the federal government in particular, although there are some bright spots at the local level, I would say, different states. However, I think it's just a rough stretch. We're forgetting that history is just full of ups and downs, and usually it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Sometimes, though, it's 2 steps forward and 3 steps back. So we may even go backwards. I mean, it kind of feels in some ways like, to me, the late 1800s, early 1900s, in some ways, in terms of how the Supreme Court has been ruling and some of the cultural trends we've seen with people being more comfortable with authoritarianism again. However, I do still think firmly that the vast majority of Americans are against authoritarianism, and I think this is just a rough patch we have to get through. So stay hopeful. I don't think those who study history tend to be a little bit more optimistic, actually. However, listen to people that study history in terms of like what's going on, because there are history rhymes. Remember, it doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. There are patterns. I will say that, like, worldwide, there seems to be a trend right now of people like being more sympathetic to demagogues and authoritarian-leaning politicians because they are promising things that people want or they think they want. We saw this in the 1920s a lot. 100 years ago, we saw this stuff a lot, especially the 1930s. And you need to remember the reason why. In the 1920s into the 1930s, what was happening worldwide, a major depression, arguably the worst depression in world history, or at least modern world history, we should say, modern world history, the last 500 years at least. What we are seeing right now currently around the world is we've seen economic growth slow, but more importantly, we've seen wealth concentration get smaller into the hands of a smaller group of people. We have less parity in terms of wealth distribution. We need more wealth distribution all over the place. Okay, it's better for everyone. Rich people are better off when more people have more money. And we've seen inflation get out of control over the past 3 years, 4 years. That has been something that has led a lot of people down extremism paths, and that's kind of explains a lot of why people are turning to more extreme.
Tip's not really clean.
The
solder does not stick at all. Keep cleaning it over.
So it's not like this is a surprise. You study history, you see this, and people are desperate economically. There's increased scarcity, and if people lose hope, most importantly, if they lose hope in the future of their own economic prosperity, a lot of times they will turn to more extreme ideologies of politicians. So I'm getting off track here, but let's get back to this, okay? I got some more super chats, so I gotta make sure I get this before I move on. Did you say something like the director of the French Revolution would work in the U.S.? A 5-man committee? Oh, yeah, no, totally. That's what I was kind of hinting at. Something like that would definitely. Now, there's other things you'd have to change as well along with that, but I won't get into that. Christian, thank you. Watching this while working out at the gym, really. Today's goals include learning something new and getting buff like Mr. B. Well, thank you. Shout out from Michigan. Everyone ever think about doing an election night stream with vlog video streams and sharing other people? It's crossed my mind. I kind of just like to watch, though. Maybe I'll be a guest on someone's live stream. I just feel like it's too stressful to kind of do in real time. I don't know. I'll think about it. Thanks for suggesting. Kyle, thank you. Have you kept up with the French election? The far right last week, they were heavily favored to win. Yeah, so I've been keeping track of it today. Are all the results in? I haven't seen all the results.
Smells so fucking good. Not supposed to breathe it in, but it smells just divine.
Yeah, it says,
smells so
according to, well, let's go to the New York Times as well here. French election yields deadlock as left certain and the far right comes up short. The outcome left no party with an absolute majority, and France bracing for potential political paralysis. Oh, that sounds familiar, doesn't it? We've had political paralysis in the United States for the last 15 years. So yeah, definitely there are parallels. Callum, hey, what are your thoughts on synergy of presidential official community and aspiring autocrat using emergency powers to protect our democracy? I've heard of it. There's also an amendment going around now, but I'll get into that in a moment. Hoping to hear your take on the ID abortion case. Okay. I will keep that in mind. I'll write it down so I don't forget. I'm not sure what case that is. If you can give me the name of the case, that helps. Also, but thank you, Jenny. And finally, Nick, what features of the Supreme Court make it necessary? Isn't it paradoxical to democracy that our policies can be determined by unelected officials? Oh, you need unelected officials. You absolutely need unelected officials in there. Oh my goodness. It's not paradoxical at all. We are not a pure democracy. We are not. We do not want to be a pure democracy. That would be bad. That would be very, very bad. We want a representative democracy. We need something, some kind of buffer between pure democracy and, you know, like, so that's why, I mean, it's not perfect. Representative democracies are never perfect, but at least we have to prevent the tyranny of the majority, which can happen. Now, in my view, the tyranny of the majority is less of a threat now. The tyranny of the minority is more of a threat now, which is why I call for things like reforming or even abolishing the Electoral College. But yeah, like that's the short answer to that, Nick. I could have a long answer, but I want to get into these cases here. So the first case we're going to look at is the immunity for former presidents and also current presidents. The case that got probably the most attention in the media, Trump in the United States. So again, this is from the New York Times interactive site. So I'll just kind of give you the highlights of what happened. And I might just read some of this too, just to make sure I don't say anything wrong. I've looked at this whole thing earlier, so. But the 6-3 ruling on, this is the very last one they ruled on. This was, and I actually reacted to this live on Twitch exclusively on last Monday when they announced it. So I've since had time to look at more, like I read more of the decision. And my first instinct was like, okay, this isn't good, but it could have been worse. Now my instinct is, okay, this is pretty bad. This is, and you may have seen that Legal Eagle released a video about this case. However, I think he's also one of the many YouTubers who have been a bit sensationalist with this. I think they are, I mean, the whole line about in the dissent from Justice Sotomayor saying that this is now the president can be a king, I think is a bit of a stretch. However, this decision, I think, has led to chaos. But I'm jumping ahead of myself. Let me go back. So there are precedents of presidential immunity. So in 1974, the case United States v. Nixon, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled that President Richard Nixon, then still in office, had to comply with the subpoena, seeking tapes of his conversations, rejecting his claims of executive privilege. I made a video about that if you want to learn more about that. Let me first go back. The Supreme Court ruled that former President Donald Trump is partially immune from prosecution on charges that he plotted to subvert the 2020 election. The justices returned the case to the lower courts for additional analysis, saying that the president may be prosecuted for private conduct, but not official acts. So this was a 6-3 of, the 6 right-leaning justices ruled in favor of Trump, at least partially. The 3 left-leaning justices ruled against him. When we say partially, we mean that for official acts, the president can be immune from official acts. What does official acts mean? Define official acts? Nobody knows. This is something that courts have to decide, and that seems like chaos, right? So that seems like a mess. But then private conduct, which I think a lot of the stuff that he was doing, like all the election denial stuff, a lot of this was private, like calling up the uh, the Georgia, the governor of Georgia, and all these leaders in Georgia to try to subvert the 2020 election. I think that, in my opinion, is private conduct, not official acts. And so this is not over. This case is not over. All these cases are not over, I should say, because this is talking about specifically the like the fake elector scheme. I mean, remember there are lots of different charges against Trump, and a lot of them you can lump them together in the same basket. They're basically the 2020 election subversion crimes, alleged crimes, and so that would all fall into this category as well. But yeah, so the president also, Nixon in 1982, Nixon v. Fitzgerald, a closely divided courtroom, but Nixon, by then out of office, was absolutely immune from civil lawsuits. Okay, so he was immune from being sued from people, basically. And other than that, not really much to go off of. It does say that in 2020, the Supreme Court ruled by a 7-2 vote in Trump v. Vance that Trump had no absolute right to block the release of his financial records. I remember that case. It says no citizen, not even the president, is categorically above the common duty to produce evidence when called upon in a criminal proceeding. So the bottom line is, though, this does make it so that it's the president can get away with more. Now, the president already has got away with more. If you want to look at as the role of commander-in-chief, being a commander-in-chief, Congress has essentially given the president a lot of freedom to carry out the so-called terrorism. Ever since right after 9/11, the National Defense Authorization Act that gets renewed every year like clockwork. Congress easily reapproves of it, which means they're essentially giving the president whatever resources he needs to combat terrorism. Most of that continues today in the form of drone attacks or small missions, not all-out warfare, but a lot of people don't understand that we've been at war constantly since 9/11 in the name of fighting terrorism. And the war on terrorism is not over. It is ongoing. If you've ever heard someone say, oh, the war on terrorism is over, because remember, we withdrew our forces, American forces came home in Afghanistan back in 2021. No, it still goes on around the world. You'd be surprised where some Marines are currently fighting terrorism. I keep saying so-called terrorism because it's definitely subjective what you define as terrorism. And many people have called American troops terrorists as well. So it's important to understand that there are other perspectives of what the word terrorism means in terms of warfare. But regardless, the president now seems to be justified as far as getting away with, arguably war crimes. You can make the argument that every president since Franklin Roosevelt is a war criminal. Maybe not Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter even too, though you could make an argument. So I guess that's maybe what the majority thought with this ruling. But at the other side of it is, okay, where does this stop? Because the president could just, say, oh, I'm going to do anything I want in the name of national security. Does that mean, like, assassinating a political opponent? I mean, to me, a lot of this stuff is a slippery slope. I think the sensationalism has been like, oh, the president can just do whatever the heck they want in the name of security. I don't think that's how judges are going to interpret this. I don't think you need to worry about this. I do think most Americans, though, are worrying about this. If you look at down here, it says, where does the public stand? This is a link to that aforementioned website, SCOTUS blog. SCOTUS poll. It's a different website, I guess. But then what they do is this website, let's see if I can find it up. So they poll people, this is through Harvard. They poll people what they think as far as what the results should be. And if you look at the results, 74% of Americans, according to this poll through Harvard, think that former presidents are not immune from criminal prosecution for actions they took while being president, and 27% think former presidents can be immune. So that's, I'm sure most of you also would be with that majority. That's me as well. I think that the court got it wrong here, even for official actions. That's just my opinion. All right, so thanks for clarifying that, Jenny. I'll write that down. Oil v. U.S. Hey, Stephen. Good to see you here. Thank you. I've heard a lot about Project 2020, or isn't it Project 2025? Isn't that what it's called? It troubles me, but what are your thoughts? From what I've seen, it's basically a bunch of Christian nationalists coming up with a framework for President Trump if he were to get reelected. It doesn't mean that President Trump would implement it. However, a lot of people are afraid that he will. Just a couple days ago, I think, Trump, Truth Social, that he would not, that he did not approve of Project 2025. But, you know, President Trump does not have a history of telling the truth. So it's hard to know if he's telling the truth. I don't necessarily believe anything he says. No offense. Like, if somebody lies to me all the time, I mean,
Meet your next pillow. Why do we make our pillow in the shape of a cube? I'll tell you.
Benny, but I've heard a lot about your book. Good to see you again.
Hi, Jonathan.
What's happening?
Thanks for having me back. Lots happening.
My pleasure. I've heard a lot about your book. I haven't read it, but I've heard a lot about your book from a lot of people that you freaked out.
Okay, well, hopefully you can read it, and then you can decide if you're of the freaked out crowd or of the really freaked out crowd.
Oh, there's only two options?
I think so. It doesn't end well. That's the spoiler alert.
Okay, well, hold the book up. It's called Nuclear War. Yeah. What motivated?
Nuclear war, a scenario. And a very plausible scenario, from what I understand from all the defense officials I interviewed.
What motivated you to write this?
Well, 6 previous books on weapons, U.S. national security secrets, they've dedicated their lives to preventing nuclear warfare. And so, during the previous administration, fire and fury rhetoric, I began to think what happens if deterrence fails, that idea of prevention. What happens? And I took that question to the people who advise the president, who work at STRATCOM, who, command nuclear sub-forces, and learned that it doesn't end well. Not only does it not end well, 5 billion people are dead at the end of 72 minutes.
Jesus.
You begin to realize well, you quickly realize as you read the book that, there are...
Your mic's on something? Something just made a weird noise. Oh, yeah.
Carl.
That was Carl. I was like, what's going on?
It's the animal humor in a difficult subject. There's literally hundreds of thousands of people in nuclear command and control who practice 24/7, 365. What would happen if deterrence failed and we had a nuclear war? They are practicing this, Joe. And it's like, talk about being behind the veil. No one knows. It's why I think the response to this book, it's been out for 3 months, has been so extraordinary. And from both sides of the aisle. Because people now are beginning to realize if nuclear war begins, it doesn't end until there is a nuclear holocaust. And it happens so fast. There's no quickly going to your secret bunker,
Yeah, no, that's nonsense. Look at Mark Zuckerberg building a bunker in Hawaii. He's going to survive. He's building on a hurricane shelter. Yeah.
And also,
That might work.
unless he happened to be there in the exact moment when all of this went down.
Yeah, you'd have to know in advance if we're about to launch. The whole thing is terrifying. It's also, I don't see a way that it, like, if you think about the timeline between 1945 and today, it's kind of extraordinary that no one has launched a nuke. No one's, but it almost looks like a matter of time. Like, it'll be a blip in history. Like, we look at it now. Oh, because of mutually assured self-destruction, mutually assured destruction, that's what prevented people from using nuclear weapons. Like, but when? Now? Until now? Like, what is 80 years in terms of human history? It's nothing. It's a tiny little blink. It's a little nothing. And it could go sideways at any moment, and then we're back to the cave era.
We are hunter-gatherers again. In the words of Carl Sagan, who
Yeah.
is the author of Nuclear Winter. But I think what's also crazy, to your point about 1945, is when this was all set up, when the nuclear arsenals were beginning, and I take the reader through it really quickly, because I want them to just get to what happens in nuclear launch. I mean, the book is really about nuclear launch to nuclear winter. But the build-up is fascinating, because first of all, it happened so incredibly fast, and it happened under incredibly secret classified terms, so there was no, like, outside opinion. And originally, nuclear war was set up to be fought and won, which itself is absurd, and we know that now. So the rules of the game have fundamentally changed, and yet the systems are all the same. That's what's, I think, the most dangerous component of today versus, let's say, 1952, when the thermonuclears began.
And when you say the systems are the same, what do you mean exactly?
So the system of nuclear war, this idea that, well, okay, so just let's start with some basic facts. There's a nuclear triad. You know what that, okay, so triad, really simple, 3. So we have missile silos, they're called ICBMs inside of them, 4. Then we have nuclear-powered nuclear submarines that launch nuclear missiles. There are 14. Then we have the bomber force, 66 nuclear-capable bombers, triad. The president chooses what elements of that triad he's going to use when he launches a counterattack, if we ever are attacked. That system essentially exists. That was what was being developed in the 50s. The only difference was, in the old days, it was, we're going to actually use these and fight in the nuclear war. And now it's, we're going to have these all sitting around, ready to launch. We have 1,770 nuclear weapons on ready for launch status. Joe, they can be launched, some of them in 60 seconds.
And they're all pointed. Are they all, do they need a coordinate? Do they need, or are they all like
Like dunked one.
aimed at a
I'm
specific
assuming on the
area
sump
already?
pump the other day, still acting.
They're technically targeted to sea, out at sea, so they don't have a specific target. But when the command goes,
So is that a many times that that might go off?
I
Out at sea? Jesus Christ. Imagine you're out there on a sailboat. Just enjoying your time. What a beautiful place to be in the middle of the ocean. You see. What do you think about the stories of UFOs hovering over nuclear bases and shutting down their weapons? I know you've done a lot of research on this stuff. How much of that is bullshit?
that specific narrative.
Yeah.
I know of it for sure, and I think, I always approach the UFO phenomenon or I try to, at least like the eye of, or the point of view of Carl Jung, this idea that what leads here is our perception of things and our sort of deep shadow self of fear. And once the nuclear weapon was invented, our grandparents had to confront this new fundamental reality that just simply didn't exist before. And then that's with the atomic weapons. And then in the 50s, once thermonuclear weapons were invented, and the thermonuclear weapon is essentially an atomic, the thermonuclear weapon is so powerful, it uses an atomic bomb like from Hiroshima as its triggering mechanism. And so the order of magnitude of destruction, of in an instant, according to Carl Jung, looked at the UFO phenomenon and the nuclear weapons phenomenon hand in hand. Encourage anyone to read his stuff about it, because he has a much sort of, bird's eye view of it all, about why that's so terrifying to people. So the narratives, to my eye, the narratives of nuclear, alien ships hovering over nuclear bases, I have never spoken to a first-hand witness who experienced that, but I would see that in terms of the narrative of Carl Jung.
So Carl Jung's perception was that he believed that it was essentially people perceiving these things or hallucinating these things, and it was like almost like a mass hallucination. Part of the.
I don't know if he went that far. I think he left a lot more open to interpretation. I think my read of his analogy was more like the way that hundreds of years ago or thousands of years ago when Christianity was first being developed, people saw existential threats as part of the narrative of God. So my read of Carl Jung is that he's saying now in the mechanized modern world, the existential threats, the sort of damnation, is tied to machines, which is tied to, is easily tied to little machines or big machines from outer space. That was his take on it, which I think is interesting.
It's interesting that also Jung wrote this when? 60s? Yeah. So I think we know a lot more now than we knew that. I mean, this, like, the reason why I'm bringing this up is, like, the people that have hope, one of the hopes is that aliens are observing us, and they're going to wait until we are about to do something really stupid, and then they're going to come down and shut everything down.
That is an interesting narrative too, and that's sort of, but again, that's a bit, to my eye, like that Deus ex machina idea, that God would intervene and, save the faithful, and, or rather, in this situation, it might be that he's going to save those people that are paying attention.
Well, just save the human race from its folly. What is Carl talking about? You can't let that.
I think Carl likes my shoes.
Oh yeah, he likes to play. Carl didn't get enough exercise. Marshall wasn't here. He's not worn out yet. So the young thing is interesting, but we know more now. We know more now about possible other dimensions that we can access. We know more now about planets in the Goldilocks zone. We know more now about all these whistleblowers that have come out and talked about crashed retrievement programs where they're re-engineering these things and trying to understand what these things are. Diana Pasolka's work, where she's talking about how they're essentially donations. These crafts are donations, so that people are being given these things so that they can see this extraordinary technology and try to figure out how to make it. But that's one of the only ways that I see, if we did get to a point that we launch nuclear weapons at each other. Everything is over so fast. If I was an alien species, an intelligent species from somewhere else, and I recognize that this is a real possibility and that the Earth has all these different forms of life other than human beings that are going to get destroyed as well, it's going to wipe out who knows how many different species. It's going to kill everyone. And even the people that are left over, what are you left with? Whatever 2 billion people that still survive, where and what? What do you have left? What is the environment like? How polluted is everything? What kind of mutations are going to come from their offspring?
I get into that in the end of the book. So I write the book in essentially 3 acts. Like the first 24 minutes, the next 24 minutes, the last 24 minutes, and then nuclear winter. So nuclear winter is very well described by a fellow called Professor Brian Toon, who I interviewed in the book. He was one of the original 5 authors of, do you remember the nuclear winter theory of our sort of high school years?
Yes.
Right? So that was Carl Sagan was the lead author on the paper. Toon was the young student, and he's dedicated decades to looking at nuclear winter now. Originally, it was very called upon by the Defense Department. It was said, this is Soviet propaganda, this is never going to happen. And the computer systems and climate modeling have changed to the degree where we can see not only is nuclear winter what was thought in the 80s, it's actually much worse. So whereby originally they thought there would be a year of ice sheets across large bodies of water from Iowa to Ukraine, across the mid-latitudes of the globe. Now that could be up to 7 or 10 years. So think about that much frozen land for that long. You have the death of agriculture. You have, like you were talking about, you have the complete disruption of the ability for people to grow food and eat food. And so man reverts to his hunter-gatherer state. And this is all...
But hunting and gathering what?
Well, exactly. And also you have, man has to go underground. I take you through what this is like in detail because it's so bizarre to think about that you have a man-made problem, nuclear weapons, and yet people are not paying attention to the fact that whatever is created by man essentially would theoretically have a man-made solution. Like there is a solution to the nuclear weapons threat. It's not, although the results of a nuclear war would be very much like an asteroid striking the United States or the world anywhere. There's a solution. There's a solution called disarmament. We have a total of 12,200 and some odd nuclear weapons.
And is the concern that if we did that, other countries would not do that? Would be defenseless?
Yeah, absolutely. But things happen in sort of inches and feet. They don't have to happen overnight. Once upon a time, there were 70,000 nuclear warheads in 1986.
Oh, so we're making progress.
We were making progress until this past year. And these treaties are all, at risk, and people are just very busy seeing everybody else as the enemy.
This past year specifically because of what?
Well, Putin is saying he's not going to be involved in the treaty anymore. Donald Trump said he pulled us out of the treaty. So there's leaders are threatening. This is all on the table right now. It could and should be looked at. But do you remember back when we were in high school when Reagan and Gorbachev got together for the Reykjavik Agreement?
Yes.
Remember that?
Yes.
That was the beginning of the movement toward disarmament. That was the beginning of this idea of, wait a minute, 70,000 nuclear weapons is just an accident waiting to happen. And so we are at 12,500 today because of that.
And we should also say that there have been some very close calls.
The Secretary General said last year or something, we are one misunderstanding, one miscommunication away from nuclear annihilation. He's not kidding.
There was this one incident where the Soviet Union thought that we were attacking them, and there was one guy who resisted launching a counterstrike. that one guy prevented nuclear annihilation. One guy said, I think this is an error. This doesn't make sense. I'm not doing this. And that one guy saved us. I don't remember what the incident was. Like, what do you remember? What was the exact issue?
So his name was Petrov, and it was in 1983. So what's even more remarkable about him is this was at a time of, absolute animosity, enmity between the two nations. It was a really tremendous time in the world. And Petrov was in a early warning radar system, like outside of Moscow, that reads data of possible incoming nuclear missiles. And he saw what the radar scope was reading as 5 ICBMs coming from Wyoming. 5. He knew that we would send 1,000 missiles if we were going to launch. And so he questioned the data, which is just so remarkable in its own conception when you think about that. He questioned it and he didn't send it up the chain of command as a missile attack.
So what was it?
Well, I get into this in the book, which is terrifying. So let me back up for a second of how good our technology is. So we have a system in space, a satellite system called SIVERS, space-based infrared satellite system. It's like the Paul Revere of the 21st century. It was parked over our enemies that have nuclear weapons, and it can see and detect a nuclear launch of an ICBM in a fraction of a second, Joe. Confirmed fact. That's why nuclear war begins and ends in 72 minutes, because the SIVER satellite system sees the launch, and then the U.S. Nuclear Command and Control goes into begins. And by the way, an ICBM cannot be redirected and it cannot be recalled.
I just felt
What about the
hugest amount
hypersonic
of blind
weapons
shrimp
that
food.
can adjust their trajectory? They can move to different places. Like it's going to Arizona and it goes to Chicago.
So ballistic missiles are hypersonic. So a little bit of a misnomer there. And also a hypersonic missile, let's just say it went from Russia to the United States, it might take an hour. A ballistic missile launched from a launch pad outside Moscow takes 26 minutes and 40 seconds to get to Washington, D.C. That number's not going to change. That's gravity. That's physics. That's what it was in 1958, 59, and that's what it is today.
But isn't the new technology that it can alter its course?
Yes, but so if you go with that logic and you say, well, it can move around, so it would be harder to shoot down.
Right.
As I explained in the book, and again, as was relayed to me by defense officials, we can't shoot down ballistic missiles, long-range ballistic missiles, with any kind of certainty or accuracy.
It's not an Iron Dome or anything like that.
That is, the Iron Dome is almost like terrible for nuclear war, for people to understand how dangerous nuclear war is, because the Iron Dome can shoot down short-range missiles and mid-range missiles. So even the U.S. Aegis systems out on the sea, the Navy systems, shot down some of those Iranian
I had a
drones.
couple of them
But they can't
that
shoot down
ate too much and they just died
ballistic missiles. You want like the 5-minute or the
right away.
30-second
They were
ballistic
still
missile
Sure.
lesson,
food
because
everywhere.
this is what I need. I write for the layman.
Immediately went belly up and
I
they
think
got
part of the
covered.
reason why nuclear war is
I
not
changed the diet though
spoken
since
about
then.
in
I've
the
added a
general
lot of
public, because
veggies and shit. I
it's
wasn't
set
doing
up
that,
to
and it's
be
really
entertaining.
important with goldfish.
You
They
hear
eat
a lot of
plant matter and
defense
shit.
people and analysts using very esoteric language, and it kind of excludes the average Joe or Jane, Joe or Annie. So I ask really basic questions like, how does a ballistic missile work? And it's very simple. That 26 minutes and 40 seconds I told you about. So there's 3 phases of a ballistic missile. It launches, it has boost phase. First 5 minutes. Imagine a rocket. You've seen launches. That fire coming out the bottom. That boosts the rocket for 5 minutes. That's when it's detectable from space. Then it enters mid-course phase, which is going to be 20 minutes, arcing across the globe to its target. That is the only place where the interceptor 500 miles up, and it's traveling at something like Mach 23, 14,000 miles an hour. Okay, so that's 20 minutes, and then the last phase is called terminal phase, appropriately so, 100 seconds. When the warhead, nuclear warhead, re-enters the atmosphere, boom, it explodes over its target. The interceptor system is designed to take out the missile in mid-course phase. So we have 44 interceptors. Remember I told you we have about 1,700, let's say, nuclear missiles on ready for launch status. Russia has about the same. We have 44 interceptors. How are 44 interceptor missiles going to go up against more than 1,000 Russian nuclear weapons coming at us? Never mind the fact that each interceptor has a 50% shoot-down rate. And that's by the Missile Defense Agency's spokesperson. So there's this perception that we have a system like the Iron Dome that could take out these incoming missiles, and we simply don't. Which is why when nuclear war begins, it probably ends in nuclear Armageddon.
How disturbing was it for you to write this? Just do all this research and to come to these conclusions and realize that we're a lot worse shape than things we are.
I mean, when you're reporting or writing, you kind of take your hat off of the emotional or the sentimental part of things, where the mother in me, you can't think like that. You just have to tell the story, I believe. I also believe that if I can be as factual and dramatic as possible, then I will have the most readers, which is the point. I am actually not trying to save the world as a journalist. I'm trying to get you to read what I write because I found it super interesting reporting it and learning about it. And also, the whole process for me that I think is the most interesting is going to some of these people who are truly some of the smartest scientists in the world and getting them to explain it in the most basic. Like I say, you have to tell it to me like I'm a kid because I don't have a science mind. And that part is, so that excitement part of it balances out with the terror of it. Because I do also understand why most people don't want to know about this. It's too dreadful. But they also don't want to know because they end up feeling sort of looked down upon, I think, if they ask basic questions like, wait a minute, how does a missile work? Or, like you said, can't the hypersonics, shouldn't we invest in hypersonics? Well, who really wants to be lectured? And so what I try to do is condense the lectures that I receive about how it all works into this dramatic form, which is how I landed on this format of this book, which I think is really effective, which is giving it to you like a scenario. Like, this is what would happen. And then going back to all my sources. I mean, like, okay, here's something. We haven't even talked about submarines, but the submarines are completely, you cannot find them in the sea. They are stealth beyond stealth. I interviewed the former commander of the nuclear subforces, a guy called Admiral Connor. Never given an interview like this before. And I said, like, how hard is it to find a nuclear armed sub? And he said, Annie, it's easier to find a grapefruit-sized object in space than a nuclear sub under the sea. And these things are, by the way, I have a map in the back of the book that shows you how close our adversaries' enemies, call them what you will, China and Russia, how close they come to the East Coast and the West Coast of the United States regularly, which means it reduces that launch time I told you about of 26 minutes, 40 seconds. That reduces it down to sort of 10 minutes or less.
What did you think when you saw the Soviet subs that were outside of Cuba?
I thought, wow. I mean, when I began reporting this book a couple couple years ago, never did I think that I would see that while I was talking about my book with people like you after publication. Never, but in the same manner, I never thought I would hear the president of Russia threatening to use a nuclear weapon. I mean, he said he's not kidding, that he might use WMD. That was his paraphrase quote.
Did he specify, like, in what way?
He just said WMD.
Against America.
Yeah. Well, having to do with intervention in Ukraine.
Yeah. I'm sure you saw the drones that blew up on the beach. The bombs that were launched that killed civilians in Russia. The U.S. You didn't see this?
Was this like recently, yesterday? No idea.
Yeah. James, see if you can find that. But Russian civilians, including one young girl, they were showing this article, were killed by these cluster bombs that were launched by drones that are ours. That Ukraine has, and now they've launched them on Russian civilians. And it's like, here it is. Crimea video shows Russian tourists flee beach. What is that word? ATACMS? Bomblets rain down. What does that mean? Do you know what that means? ATACMS?
Well, I'm guessing they're small cluster bombs that are in the nose cone of the warhead.
Make that word just so I read the whole thing, Jim. The video shows the beach in Sevastopol, Crimea, which was struck by a series of explosions on June 23rd. The footage captured by a security camera shows hundreds of people beginning to run away from the water before the impact of cluster warhead starts.
What's happening in Ukraine is so profoundly dangerous for everyone.
So this is the scene right there. So these things just drop down on the water. It's just pure terrorists.
Well, it's also remarkable that we have so much available footage and so much citizen journalism that people can see these events and discuss them.
So it says here, the event was caused by Russian air defenses shooting down a series of cluster warhead missiles, one of which altered course as a result. The Russian Ministry of Defense said that 4 of the 5 missiles launched were shot down, adding another missile as a result of the impact of air defense systems at the final stage deviated from the flight path, with the warhead exploding in the air over the city. The detonation of the fragmentation warhead of the 5th American missile in the air led to numerous casualties.
Literally weaken themselves right to death.